In the heart of Rome, beneath marble columns and ancient temples, the crowd stood frozen. Before their eyes rose the rostra, the platform where speeches once stirred the city into action. But on that day, there were no words, only silence, and it was far more terrifying. On the wooden boards lay the nailed head of a man once admired by thousands, the man they had listened to with awe. Beside it, two severed hands, clenched in lifeless stillness, as if they still held the energy that once bent both Senate and people to his will. It was a sign too clear to ignore. Rome was no stranger to political purges, to public punishments, to the downfall of enemies. But this was different. This was not just another victim of power. This was the man who embodied the Republic itself, the man whose words were sharper than a sword. And now, in an instant, that voice was silenced by iron. The people could do nothing but watch in disbelief. Those who had once heard him remembered the cutting edge of his wit, how he mocked rivals, how he stripped bare their greed and arrogance. Even the most confident generals trembled under his tongue. Now, on the very spot where his thunderous words once rang out, there was only a silence sharper than any curse. The message was obvious. This was not about removing an enemy. It was about public humiliation. His body had been dismembered in such a way that no one could doubt the meaning. Both the mind that shaped ideas and the hands that wrote them had been destroyed. Everyone looking at the rostra knew this was no accident. It was revenge, carefully prepared and staged to strike fear into the heart of anyone who dared to raise their voice. Every drop of blood sinking into the wood declared one man's victory and another's ruin. The Romans said nothing, but in their eyes was the same question. How could the man who once swayed the fate of assemblies with a word or a gesture end in such brutal disgrace? What had become of a city where speech was the greatest weapon if its master was now displayed as a trophy? And who was the man who turned private vengeance into this public spectacle? No answer was spoken, but everyone knew. Behind this grim scene lay the story of a long struggle, not between armies, but between voice and sword. And it was that struggle that turned the rostra from a platform of words into a stage for silence. The Ides of March split Rome in two. On the marble floor of the Senate lay the body of the dictator, pierced by 23 knives. Those who called themselves liberators believed they had restored freedom to the city. Instead, they opened a void. Power belonged to no one, and every man with an army or a voice rushed to claim it. From that chaos, two figures emerged. One was Marcus Tullius Cicero, a man without ancient lineage, but with a gift for words that could reconcile even the bitterest enemies. For him, Caesar's death was a chance to restore the old republic, ruled by law and the Senate. To another, Mark Antony was a hardened general, Caesar's closest ally. To him, the assassins were not heroes, but traitors. His strength lay not in speeches, but in the loyalty of legions and the favor of the crowd. Thus, Rome became the battlefield of two forces, philosopher and soldier. One believed salvation lay in tradition, the other in the strong hand of a single leader. The question was never whether they could agree. The question was, who would strike first? For two different Romes could not exist at once. Caesar's funeral set the city aflame. In the Forum, Antony stood before the pyre. His speech was no dry eulogy. He spoke of a friend, a general, a man whose victories Rome owed everything to. Each word was calculated, each pause pushing the crowd toward fury. And when he revealed Caesar's blood-stained toga, the people broke. Shouts turned to roars, roars to rage. They stormed the houses of the conspirators, tearing down their possessions, driving the so-called saviors of the Republic into flight. In a single day, Antony became the symbol of vengeance and the heir to Caesar's power. His words lit hatred like wildfire, and even seasoned senators understood. Next to this man, words could be as dangerous as weapons. For Cicero, it was the first chilling sign that the coming battle would be not just for power, but for the right to speak in Rome's name. For a moment, fragile peace settled over the city. Antony even reached for compromise. He supported the law abolishing the dictatorship forever, and hinted he might work with the Senate. It seemed that, out of chaos, a new balance could be born, where old enemies found common ground. But beneath the surface lay an abyss. Cicero dreamed of law and equality before tradition. Antony saw himself as Caesar's true successor, where the will of one man outweighed all councils. Their visions of Rome were irreconcilable, two worlds that could never meet. Peace held only because the city was exhausted from blood. Yet everyone felt it. One tremor, and Rome would collapse into conflict again. To Antony, Cicero was nothing but a pompous bookman. To Cicero, Antony was a brute leading a mob. And so the question hung in the air. Who would shatter the silence first? The silence broke with Cicero's voice. That autumn, he stood before the Senate and delivered the first of his speeches that history would call the Philippics. His words spared nothing. He attacked not only Antony's politics, but his character. He called him a drunk, a libertine, a man without honor. His second speech was so savage that Cicero did not dare speak it aloud. He simply spread it through the city in writing. Scrolls passed from hand to hand, and with each new reader, Antony's image crumbled. Rome whispered of his debts, his vices, his disgraces. For a general used to the respect of legions and crowds, this loss of reputation was worse than a wound in battle. The Philippics turned Antony from Caesar's heir into a laughingstock. And the louder Cicero's voice grew, the deeper Antony's hatred burned, waiting for the chance to strike back. At that moment, a new figure stepped onto the stage. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's adopted son, just 19 years old. His youth seemed a guarantee of obedience. Cicero saw in him the perfect tool. The boy could rally legions against Antony and, after victory, yield to the old order. Cicero placed in him hopes he trusted to no senator. To him, Octavian was not a partner, but a weapon, fragile, sharp, aimed at Antony. The statesman believed he could keep the young heir under control and use his strength to save the Republic.
But hidden in that gamble was a fatal mistake. The boy, whom Cicero saw as a pawn, was preparing to become a player. And the man who thought himself a mentor did not see that at his side was rising someone far more dangerous than Antony. The Senate backed Cicero, declaring Antony an enemy of the state. War followed. In 43 BC, at Mutina, Antony's forces were defeated. It seemed the politician's pen had triumphed over the general's sword. Rome briefly believed in the Republic's victory. Antony retreated beyond the Alps, disgraced and exiled. The city celebrated his fall, and Cicero's name once again shone as the voice of freedom. He was sure fate had chosen his side, that the old laws and order would return. But Antony was not broken. In his mind, Cicero's biting words still burned like an unhealed wound. Humiliation became fuel for vengeance. While the senators congratulated each other, in exile a revenge was taking shape, one that would exceed their darkest fears. After Mutina, fortunes shifted. Both consuls leading the Senate's army died suddenly, and in an instant, All their troops fell under Octavian's command. The Senate tried to dictate terms to him, but he would not be a dutiful student. First, he demanded honors. Then, he marched his legions straight on Rome, forcing the city to bow to his will. At that moment, Cicero's fate took a sharp turn. The young heir he had trusted turned to his enemies. On a small island in the river, Octavian met with Antony and Lepidus. There they sealed an agreement that would be remembered as the Second Triumvirate. This was no secret conspiracy like that of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. Now power was written into law. 3 men were granted the right to rule Rome without limits, to judge, to pass laws, to order executions without trial. The Republic slipped fully into the shadow of dictatorship. Their first act was to draw up lists of enemies. The prescriptions were meant to clear the road to power and fill the treasury with confiscated property. A hunt began. Anyone whose name appeared on a list became prey. Soon, one name rose above the rest, the name Antony wanted most.
The proscriptions spread terror. Posters were pasted across the forums. Anyone who found their name there understood at once you were no longer a citizen, but a target. Your property belonged to the state. Your life belonged to whoever reported or struck first. Family ties counted for nothing. Lepidus put his own brother on the list. Antony listed an uncle. But one name mattered above all: Cicero. For Antony, this was not politics, it was personal. The Philippics, the mocking, stinging speeches, had stripped the general of honor again and again, turning a legionary hero into a figure of ridicule. Years of hatred finally found release. Antony insisted that Cicero be placed at the top of the list.
Octavian, who not long before had admired the orator and seen him as an ally, resisted at first. He delayed 2 days, but under pressure, he yielded. The young politician proved he was willing to sacrifice even those who believed in him to preserve his own power. So Cicero's name went first on the death roll. It was not a court sentence, it was an order to hunt. In that moment, it became clear. Antony did not only want to remove an opponent, he wanted to erase him, to turn the great defender of the Republic into a warning to anyone who dared speak too loudly. When Cicero learned his name headed the proscription, he understood the outcome was decided. He was in his 60s, worn by years of struggle, but he still hoped to escape. From his villa near Tusculum, he set out south toward the sea, planning to board a ship for Macedonia. There, he thought, he might find refuge. But his path was fraught with hesitation. He changed his mind, delayed, returned. His brother, also proscribed, tried to help, but was captured and executed. Cicero would climb aboard a ship, then step back ashore. Seasickness and fear of the open sea froze him. Each day, his indecision seemed to nudge fate closer to its tragic end. Finally, he stopped at his coastal estate in Formiae. Servants begged him to flee, to resist, but, according to ancient writers, he looked on with weary resignation. "I will leave life in the land I so often saved," he said, as if putting a full stop on his story. That slow, almost willing waiting made him all the more tragic. The man who had fought his whole life with words seemed to accept that his voice was exhausted. But his enemies were already on his trail. There was no time left for doubt. A detachment caught him quickly. It was led by the centurion Herennius and the tribune Popilius, the same man Cicero had once defended in court. The irony was bitter. A former client, spared by the orator's words, now came with a sword to take that voice away. The servants prepared to fight, grabbed arms, but Cicero stopped them. He would not have another man's blood shed for his rescue. The old man walked out to meet his killers with a strange calm. They carried him on a litter, and eyewitnesses say he himself ordered them to set it down. Historians preserve his last words. Stroking his chin with a trembling hand, as if bracing for the end, he said, "There is nothing proper in what you do, soldier, but do your duty cleanly." The blow was clumsy, The head did not come off at once. The blade fell again and again, until the body finally went limp. Even then, Antony demanded more. He wanted not only the face and voice destroyed, but the hands that penned the Philippics. The soldiers obeyed. So Cicero's life ended not in the Senate or on the rostra, but on a deserted road by the sea, taken by pupils of his own school. Yet the real revenge was only beginning. His body was to be turned into a symbol, a spectacle for all Rome. The severed head and hands were brought to the city as trophies. The soldiers presented them to Antony out in the forum. Ancient accounts say he laughed and lavishly rewarded the killers. For him, it was not simply the end of an enemy, it was a staged act of retribution.
By his order, the remains were nailed to the rostra, that same place where Cicero's voice had once thundered. Where crowds had gathered and Senate decrees gained force through speech, now a terrible display rose. Instead of words, there was dead silence. Instead of calls for freedom, a mute warning. People came and stared in disbelief. For many, the scene was an insult not only to the orator's memory, but to the very idea of the Republic. The head that once birthed speeches and the hands that wrote the Philippics were shown off as trophies of power. The symbol of liberty was turned into an instrument of terror. Antony wanted everyone to understand one thing. From now on, no one must dare to challenge power. He had achieved more than victory over a man. He had imposed silence on the very spot where words had once ruled the crowd. When Cicero's head was taken to Antony's house, his wife, Fulvia, was there. Her hatred of the orator was personal. Cicero had mocked her in his speeches, ridiculed her past, and reminded Rome of her earlier marriages. For a woman steeped in political strife, that was an insult she had not forgotten. Fulvia approached the head and did more than spit in contempt. Ancient writers report she stuck out her tongue, the same tongue that once dared to accuse her husband, and, taking a hairpin, stabbed it several times. It was not a political gesture, but a personal one. Revenge carried beyond restraint. Even for Romans used to cruelty, the scene was grotesque. But that was the point, to destroy not only the body, but the symbol, to shame memory itself, to mock the power of speech. In Fulvia's eyes, Cicero's tongue had been a weapon that struck their family hardest, and now she avenged each word that had cut them from the rostra. This episode was the final stroke in the act of vengeance. The head and hands on the forum were a warning to anyone who dared to speak. And Fulvia's cruelty toward Cicero's tongue showed how deeply his enemies hated him for fighting not with the sword, but with words. A new era was beginning in Rome, an era of fear. The prescriptions renewed by the triumvirs spread over the city like a black net. Lists of names appeared on walls, and every citizen knew tomorrow it could be his turn. Family bonds meant nothing. Fathers betrayed sons, brothers betrayed brothers, all to save their own lives. The streets filled with hunters. Those whose names appeared on the lists were seized in day-broad light. Their houses were looted, their property claimed by the state, and their killers received rewards. Rome, once the center of law and justice, now lived under the rules of hunting and denunciation. Among the victims were senators, knights, wealthy citizens. Hundreds of powerful families were destroyed. The confiscations swelled the coffers of the triumvirs, funding new legions. Fear and gold went hand in hand.
For Antony, the greatest triumph was personal. The man who had mocked him before the Republic was now destroyed in public, disgraced even after death. Outwardly, it looked like total victory, yet in truth, it was fleeting. The land was sinking into blood and darkness, And from that darkness, new figures were already rising to challenge Antony himself. While Antony reveled in his grim triumph, another rival grew in the shadows, the young Octavian. He was still too youthful to frighten veterans, but he possessed what most senators lacked: cold calculation and the patience to wait. In Rome, he shaped his image not as Cicero's pupil or Antony's ally, but as the guardian of Roman tradition and Caesar's name. Antony, meanwhile, tied his fate ever more closely to the east. His bond with Cleopatra became not only personal but political. To many Romans, it looked like betrayal. A general once sworn to Rome now seemed a captive of the Egyptian queen. Octavian saw the weakness. He launched a campaign where every word struck like a weapon. In speeches and proclamations, Antony was no longer Caesar's heir, but a man bewitched by a foreign queen, forgetting his homeland. To the people, he became a new tyrant, the very figure Cicero had once warned against. So began a new war, not only of armies, but of images. And for the first time, Antony faced an opponent who could wield words almost as sharply as Cicero once had. The decisive moment came at Actium in 31 BC. On one side stood Octavian's legions and fleet, on the other, Antony and Cleopatra's forces. It was more than a battle of armies, it was a battle for Rome's future, a state ruled by discipline and tradition, or an empire led by passion and Eastern allure. At first, Antony seemed able to hold his ground, but then Cleopatra's fleet suddenly broke away and sailed out to sea. Blinded by his devotion to her, Antony abandoned his lines and followed. Leaderless, his legions wavered and surrendered. The defeat was catastrophic. Rome saw not just a military loss, but shame. The stern, fearless general had become a prisoner of his own passions. Octavian had won not only the battle, but the image. He now stood as Rome's protector, the man who saved the Republic from becoming a plaything of a foreign queen. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Egypt with what remained of their forces, but their end was sealed. The sword he had trusted all his life failed him at the crucial moment. Where calculation and resolve were needed, he chose impulse and attachment. That choice was his downfall. Trapped in Egypt, Antony saw everything he had lived for collapse. Legions deserted to Octavian, allies turned away, and his name was spoken with mockery. In the eyes of his contemporaries, he became a shadow of the commander who once seemed invincible. His life ended in despair. With no hope left, he fell on his own sword, and Cleopatra followed. In that moment, memory of Cicero returned with force. Yes, he had died in agony and been displayed as a trophy, but his words lived on. They were copied, studied, repeated. They reminded men what the Republic meant, what law and freedom meant.
Antony had defeated his body, but history judged differently. The sword gave him a fleeting triumph, but the word gave Cicero immortality. Rome forgot the banquets and campaigns of Antony, but remembered the lines that exposed tyranny. The contrast was too clear to miss. Antony nailed Cicero's head and hands to the rostra to erase him. Instead, the gesture turned Cicero into a martyr and Antony into a warning. Proof of how personal hatred can destroy even a great general. In the end, history preserved for each a different legacy. Antony became the symbol of brief power and ruthless revenge. Cicero became the symbol of the voice that outlives the sword. The story of Cicero and Antony is not just the drama of two men, it was the moment Rome chose. From words to swords, from republic to empire. On the rostra, where once the city's fate was shaped by speech, there now hung trophies of cruelty. It was meant to mark the end of free words. But the result was different. Cicero's words survived his death,
Monks copied them in scriptoria, Renaissance thinkers drew on them, founders of new states read them. His ideas of law, justice, and duty echoed across centuries, turning defeat into victory of memory. Antony remained in history as a man who could command legions but could not master his own passions. His revenge on Cicero looked grand in the moment, but with time it came to be seen as an act of desperation. He won the day, but lost eternity. That is the lesson. Force can silence a voice, nail head and hands to wood, terrify a crowd into silence, but thought cannot be killed. An idea, once given words, continues to live long after the man is gone. Cicero could not save the republic he fought for, but he became its symbol. Antony had his triumph, but became only a shadow in memory. And so history delivered its judgment. The sword can win the battle, but the word wins the centuries.